Welcome back to her Fireside Stories. Dear friends, they changed the locks, but what truly made my throat tighten was when they changed the frame that once held my wedding photo with Robert. I didn't cry. I just stood there quietly staring at the new picture. Pretty, yes, but unfamiliar. And in that moment, I understood I was no longer seen as part of this home. My name is Margaret Lindley. I used to believe that growing old with family was life's gentlest gift, but when my voice began to vanish into silence, I found myself doing the one thing no mother ever dreams of, standing up and walking away to preserve what little was left of myself. I never imagined I'd see the day where my own children would look right past me as if I were a ghost in the house I built with my late husband, Robert. My name is Margaret Lindley. I'm 72 years old. Until recently, I lived in a sprawling two-story home on a quiet street with a large oak tree in the front yard, our family's refuge for decades. It was the place where I cooked thousands of meals, where we celebrated birthdays and graduations, and where in the living room, Robert first taught our son James how to tie his shoelaces. If walls could talk, ours would share stories of laughter, tears, teenage drama, and bedtime kisses. I thought I would grow old there in the warm glow of familiar memories, but life rarely goes according to plan. The day after Robert's funeral, I stood in the living room feeling lost in a space that had once been a sanctuary. My son James and his wife Caroline bustled around moving furniture and boxes as if they owned the place. "Mom, you should sit down," James said, his voice curiously gentle, but his eyes distant. He offered me a new recliner they'd just purchased, an unsolicited replacement for Robert's beloved armchair. The details were small at first, but the change of atmosphere was unmistakable. My home no longer felt like mine. It was suddenly full of subtle intrusions. New picture frames that replaced the old ones I cherished. A different brand of dish soap that smelled foreign, and rugs laid across the hardwood floors, hiding the scuff marks that told our family's story. I tried to tell myself they were just trying to help. Maybe they thought redecorating would ease my grief. After all, losing Robert had torn a hole in my heart, and I was drifting aimlessly, unsure of how to fill my days. But as time passed, their helpfulness began to feel more like control. Caroline started rearranging the living room without so much as asking. She'd move the sofa under the bay window, place decorative figurines on the mantel that I'd never seen before. If I tried to say something, I'd get patronizing smiles. "Oh, Margaret, we just thought it would look nice this way. We know how hard it must be for you to deal with everything right now." In these moments, I felt invisible, overshadowed by my own son and his wife. Worse, I felt like a burden. I'd shuffle around the kitchen, careful not to bump into them as they unpacked groceries I hadn't asked for. They'd speak to me in gentle tones, the way one might address a child who can't quite understand. I chalked it up to grief at first. My husband had been gone only a few weeks. Maybe I was imagining slights where there were none. But the feeling grew day by day, that something was slipping away. A sense of belonging, the right to feel at ease in my own space. A particular afternoon stands out in my memory. Caroline had just finished reorganizing the pantry, pulling items off shelves, setting them on the counter. She looked at me with pity. "Maybe it's time you just took it easy, Margaret," she said. "You've done enough already." That was the moment I realized the dynamic had shifted. I was no longer the matriarch. In their eyes, I was a fading presence, an old woman clinging to remnants of the past. And as they busied themselves, I felt my heart ache with the realization that I might be witnessing the beginning of my own erasure in the home I had once ruled with warmth and love. There's a peculiar loneliness that comes when the people you love most begin to treat you like an afterthought. After Robert's passing, the house was quiet for a while, but it wasn't the peaceful quiet I might have hoped for. The hush in the hallways felt more like a vacuum, as if the very air had been sucked out, leaving me alone with my grief. Then came the slow fade, the subtle shift in how James and Caroline interacted with me. At first, they were gentle but distant. They offered to do the cooking, but never asked what I liked to eat. They insisted on paying some of the bills, but never discussed the details with me. I remember the day James brought home paint swatches, carefully selecting shades of cream and pale blue. He said he wanted to lighten up the living room. "A fresh start, Mom," he told me, a confident smile on his face. I looked around the room at the walls. Robert and I had chosen to paint a soft sunflower yellow after I fell in love with the color on a spring road trip. Those walls held so many memories. The pencil marks from our children's heights, faint outlines where family portraits had once hung. The idea of covering them up felt like erasing a past I wasn't ready to let go of. Yet, when I tried to protest, it was as if my words fell on deaf ears. Over time, I began to notice a pattern. My opinions were either dismissed or just not sought at all. I felt like a piece of furniture that had become outdated, something they were reluctant to discard out of sentiment, but also didn't want in the middle of the room. I'm not saying my son and daughter-in-law were cruel. Maybe they thought they were doing what was best. But intentions don't always matter when you find yourself pushed to the margins of your own life. It was small things at first, Caroline deciding to rearrange my silverware drawer or reorganize my Tupperware. They always asked me to rest, to take it easy, but I wasn't tired from the household tasks. I was tired from feeling unheard. Then there were bigger steps, James speaking to me like I was a child, or Caroline inviting her friends over and forgetting to tell me. I'd discover they were hosting a small gathering only when I heard clinking wine glasses in the living room and the chatter of unfamiliar voices floating down the hallway. One afternoon, I found myself eating lunch in the garage simply because the kitchen felt too busy. It wasn't that there were so many people milling about. It was just that I no longer felt comfortable. I worried I'd get in the way or say the wrong thing. I sat there amid the stored Christmas decorations and old bicycles nibbling on a sandwich and wondering how it had come to this. How did the woman who once baked birthday cakes for entire soccer teams end up exiled to her own garage? The heartbreaking answer was that I allowed it to happen, but I also didn't see it coming until it was too late. I convinced myself that I was overreacting. My children were simply trying to help. Maybe they saw me as fragile. Maybe they were concerned about my health or my emotional state after losing my husband. But despite these justifications, the knot in my stomach told me something was deeply wrong. The feeling of being an intruder in my own home was impossible to ignore. As the weeks passed, I found more evidence that my role in the household was diminishing. Caroline began making grocery lists, without my input, choosing foods based on their preferences rather than mine. I discovered that my beloved spice rack, a collection of seasoning jars I'd curated over decades, had been relocated to a high shelf I couldn't easily reach. When I asked James about it, he gave me a nonchalant shrug. Caroline said we needed the counter space. Besides, we didn't think you'd be cooking much anymore. His words lingered in the air, stinging more than I wanted to admit. Cooking was never just about food for me. It was a way I expressed love, a bridge connecting me to memories of Robert and the children when they were young. Even a simple pot of soup simmering on the stove brought me comfort. Now I felt like a spectator in a kitchen I had once commanded with ease and confidence. I tried to occupy myself with other tasks, tending to the garden, flipping through old photo albums, dusting the shelves. But even these activities became reminders of my new reality. The flower beds I'd carefully nurtured were uprooted for a more modern look, and the photos of Robert and me traveling the country were placed in a cardboard box because Caroline needed space for contemporary art. It was surreal watching the tangible pieces of my history quietly removed. What hurt the most was the way James started speaking to me. He wasn't outright rude, but his tone had shifted to something patronizing, as if he were talking to one of his children instead of his own mother. If I forgot to close the fridge or left a light on, he'd sigh and say, "Mom, you're not as sharp anymore. Let us handle these things. You should rest." It was a blow to my pride, but more than that, it felt like a declaration that I no longer had agency over my life. I tried reaching out to a few old friends, but many of them had passed away or moved to other states to live near their own children. I spent hours on the phone with my sister Kathleen, who lived out in Oregon. She listened sympathetically, reassuring me that I wasn't crazy for feeling pushed out. "You have every right to be respected in your own home, Maggie," she said. But she also reminded me that James was my son and probably just stressed. They have a new baby on the way, right? Sometimes young families lose sight of the bigger picture in the rush of daily life. That thought alone gave me some solace. The idea that maybe this was just a phase. I told myself they didn't mean to hurt me, that maybe they believed they were doing what was best. But even if that was true, the result was the same. I felt like an unwanted guest in a place I'd spent a lifetime building. Late one evening, as I lay in bed listening to the muffled sound of laughter from the living room, a tear slipped down my cheek. It wasn't just grief over Robert's absence. It was the slow realization that my son, the child I once held and rocked to sleep, might be seeing me through different eyes. Eyes that no longer recognized the woman who had raised him, and it left me with a sinking feeling that something was about to change sooner than I expected. I'll never forget the day I stepped outside to pick up the mail and noticed the change. The mailbox had only my son's name on it, James Lindley, painted neatly over the spot where the Lindley family used to appear. It was such a small detail, but it felt like a statement. A silent claim that this house, once the domain of Robert and me, now belonged solely to them. I froze there, the mail in my hand, staring at the letters that also bore James and Caroline's names. Where once the bills had arrived addressed to Robert or me, now they were addressed to my son and his wife. I stood on the front porch for a moment, looking at the door, half expecting them to pop out and say something like, "Surprise, we're helping you." But the door remained closed, the window still as if keeping secrets. When I finally did walk back in, I felt a chill. The living room walls had already been repainted a soft cream, but in the daylight I could see the faint lines where photographs had once hung. The furniture was repositioned. Boxes labeled "Mom Stuff" were stacked in a corner as if waiting to be shipped off to another world. That night, James casually mentioned that they were consolidating bills to simplify things. He used phrases like streamlining expenses and keeping track of finances, but never once did he ask if I was okay with it. When I brought up the mailbox, Caroline gave a little laugh. "It was just easier to have all the mail in one name," she said. "Didn't want important documents getting lost." I bit my tongue, trying not to argue. I was starting to understand that my protestations would fall on deaf ears. Around the same time, they began moving my belongings around without consulting me. The master bedroom, once a cozy space Robert and I shared for decades, was declared too big for just one person, meaning me. They said they needed it for storage for the baby's future nursery, for their growing collection of furniture. I found my clothes hastily shoved into a smaller closet in what used to be the guest room. Then, in a startling twist, they announced that the guest room was no longer suitable for me to sleep in because Caroline's sister might visit more often. So I was told really to move down to the basement. I can still recall the sting of standing in that chilly, unfinished basement, the single light bulb swinging overhead as I tried to make the space livable. I dragged a cot to one side, placed a small nightstand near the furnace, and tried to ignore the boxes of holiday decorations looming like silent witnesses to my displacement. For 3 weeks, I struggled to sleep down there, the cement floor leaching cold into my bones. Whenever I brought up how uncomfortable it was, James would wave me off. "It's temporary, Mom, until we get things sorted." What they didn't realize was that each night I spent in the basement, I lay awake, heart pounding, formulating a plan. because, as humiliating as the situation was, I wasn't ready to let them crush my spirit. They might have pushed me down to the lowest level of my own home, but they had overlooked one crucial detail. I had never taken my name off the deed. The basement nights were the hardest. I'd lie there and listen to footsteps above me. Sometimes I'd hear the two of them laughing, or Caroline's friends chattering when they came by for a visit. There was clinking of wine glasses and the low hum of conversation that never included me. More often than not, I'd stare at the ceiling and remember a time when Robert and I hosted neighbors in that very living room. We'd play card games and talk about the weather or the kids' school events. Back then, laughter echoed through the halls, and I felt pride in my home, the same walls that now felt like they were closing in on me. The hardest part wasn't even the physical discomfort. It was the realization that my own son was capable of turning a blind eye to my pain. Every day I'd see him and he'd say things like, "You doing okay?" Mom and I'd nod or mumble a yes, not wanting to cause conflict, but deep inside a small flicker of anger and resentment began to grow. It wasn't that I wanted to lash out or harm him. I just wanted to be recognized, respected, acknowledged as a person who still had some fight left in her. On one of those nights, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept thinking back to the day Robert and I finished paying off the mortgage. We'd celebrate it with a simple dinner at our favorite local restaurant, feeling triumphant that we now fully owned our home. We joked about it belonging to us until the day we die, with no thought that our own children might one day claim it as their own prematurely at that. And I remembered how carefully Robert and I had set up our will, how we'd kept my name on every important document, ensuring that if anything ever happened, I wouldn't have to worry about losing the house. That memory was like a key turning in a lock. It dawned on me that while my son and daughter-in-law had effectively taken over the day-to-day running of the household, they had forgotten to check the legalities. I was still the official owner, and all the official paperwork was in my possession, safe in a filing cabinet. They had barely glanced at. More importantly, I had maintained a power of attorney that Robert and I had set up years ago, giving me full control to manage the property if circumstances warranted it. By the time morning light filtered through the tiny basement window, I'd made up my mind I was done feeling trapped. That very day after James and Caroline left for work, I rummaged through my old desk. Hidden behind a stack of old photos and letters, I found the folder with the deed, the mortgage receipts, the power of attorney, everything. My hands shook as I read through each page, but not from weakness, rather from the realization that I had been given a way out, a chance to reclaim what was mine. Yet I knew I needed a plan. Marching upstairs and confronting them directly would only lead to a fight, and I wasn't sure my heart could handle that. I wanted a clean exit, a decisive move that would leave no room for doubt. The moment I decided to leave, I also decided not to give them any warning. A quiet disappearance might be my best strategy. They had taken over my home, but they had not taken everything from me. The next day, I waited until James and Caroline left for work before I started packing. It felt surreal gathering my clothes and personal items into two suitcases, as if I were a guest quietly checking out of a hotel. I moved quietly, methodically, unsure if a neighbor or a friend of Caroline's might drop by unannounced. My heart pounded in my chest, but with every item I packed, I felt a surge of determination. I took only what mattered: clothes for all seasons, a few treasured photographs of Robert, and most importantly, the folder of legal documents I left behind the furniture, the old piano Robert used to play, even my grandmother's china. It hurt, of course. Those items were laden with memories and sentimental value, but I had a growing conviction that no material possession was worth the constant feeling of being unwanted. And besides, I suspected that the real leverage I needed fit neatly in that folder. Before I stepped out the front door, I paused in the hallway. I closed my eyes and inhaled the faint scent of lavender potpourri, a fragrance Caroline had chosen, not me. Then I scribbled a note on a small piece of paper and set it on the kitchen counter. I'm fine. Don't come looking. My handwriting was shaky, but the message was clear enough. A part of me wondered if they'd even care if they'd read it with genuine concern or dismiss it as another whim of their elderly mother. Walking down the driveway felt surreal. I glanced back at the house at the porch where Robert and I once sat, rocking in old chairs on summer evenings. The oak tree's branches swayed gently in the breeze, casting dappled shadows on the lawn. For a second, I felt a pang of regret. This was my home, the place where I'd raised my children. Now I was leaving it behind by choice, but I reminded myself that staying had become unbearable and that sometimes survival means making the hardest choice of all. I flagged down a cab at the corner and climbed into the back seat with my suitcases. The driver, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, asked where I was headed. I told her I needed to go to a senior apartment complex on the other side of town, a modest place I'd researched quietly over the past couple of weeks. As the cab pulled away, I thought of James and Caroline returning home later that evening, finding the note. Would they worry? Would they shrug it off? Either way, it no longer mattered because for the first time in years, I felt a sense of control over my own life. When I arrived at the senior apartment, the manager greeted me warmly. The building wasn't fancy, but it was clean and safe. The apartment she showed me was small, a kitchenette, a living area, and a cozy bedroom, but it felt like a palace compared to that cold basement. I signed the lease without hesitation, relieved that my own savings were enough to cover the deposit and the next few months of rent. That first night, I slept like a child, deep and unbroken. No footsteps above me, no voices telling me what I could and couldn't do. In the quiet darkness of my new space, I found a moment of peace. Ironically, I had to leave my own home to finally feel at home again. Days turned into weeks. I heard very little from James or Caroline in that time. Perhaps they thought I would return tail between my legs, asking for permission to sleep in the basement again, or maybe they were relieved to have me out of the picture so they could forge ahead with their lives. Regardless, my phone stayed silent and I began establishing a new routine. I started my mornings with a cup of tea by the window, watching the sun rise over the city skyline. In the afternoons, I sometimes ventured to the community center to join the yoga class for seniors, something I never thought I'd do, but found surprisingly enjoyable. Occasionally, I'd hear scraps of gossip through distant family channels. A cousin of mine, Sharon, called one day to see how I was faring. She mentioned that she'd dropped by the old house to visit James and Caroline. They seemed to have settled in nicely, she said, her voice tinged with concern. New furniture, new curtains, even a fresh coat of paint in the nursery. I felt a hollow pang in my chest, imagining my sewing room once filled with spools of thread and half-finished quilts now transformed for their baby. Still, I kept my voice steady. "I'm glad they're doing well," I said. Sharon fell silent, perhaps not knowing what else to say. I tried not to dwell on what was happening at the house. It felt like a different world now, one that no longer included me. Yet in quiet moments, I'd catch myself remembering the squeak of the stairs or the pattern of sunlight on the kitchen floor. It was bittersweet, like fond memories tinted with sadness. But every time I felt a twinge of regret, I'd remind myself that I hadn't left empty-handed. I still possessed something invaluable, my legal claim to that property. In the meantime, I made a trip downtown to pay the property taxes. It was almost comical how easy it was to do so. The deed was in my name, and as long as the tax bills were paid, no one batted an eye. Clearly, James and Caroline had forgotten or never bothered to check who was officially listed as the owner. Perhaps they assumed that since they'd been managing day-to-day bills and had their names on the mailbox, the house was theirs. They were sorely mistaken. I carried that secret close to my heart, unsure of how or when I'd use it. Part of me hoped that my children would reach out, apologize, or at least try to mend fences. Another part of me felt a quiet determination, a readiness to protect myself and my interests if it came down to it. My new neighbor, an elderly gentleman named Harold, noticed my thoughtful mood one day. "You look like someone with a lot on your mind," he said, smiling kindly. I nodded and admitted that I was dealing with some family troubles. He patted my shoulder gently. "Stay strong," he said. "Sometimes we have to do what's best for us." Those words resonated with me. For too long, I had done what was best for everyone else: my husband, my children, the entire household. Now, with Robert gone, I realized that looking after myself wasn't selfish. It was necessary. The past few weeks had been the most peaceful I'd experienced in a long time. And yet a small voice inside reminded me that the storm wasn't over. A day would come when the truth about the house's ownership would surface, and I needed to be prepared. Before we continue, I genuinely hope you're immersed in Margaret's journey. If her story resonates with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to share a comment or let me know how you feel. Your support and feedback mean a lot and help me continue crafting stories that touch the heart. Now let's return to Margaret and her unfolding tale. It was a crisp morning when I decided to visit my lawyer. The sun was shining, but a brisk wind blew leaves across the sidewalk. I clutched the handle of my purse a little tighter than usual, partly from nerves and partly from the determination I felt building inside of me. My lawyer, Jeffrey Collins, was a kind man, a few years younger than me. He had handled some paperwork for Robert years ago, and he knew our family history well enough to understand the dynamics. I walked into his office, greeted by the soft hum of the receptionist's computer and the faint aroma of coffee. Jeffrey came out to meet me, his face lighting up in a warm smile. "Margaret, it's been too long," he said, extending a hand. After exchanging a few pleasantries, I handed him the folder containing the deed, the mortgage receipts, and the power of attorney forms. He flipped through the papers carefully, brow furrowing with concentration. Occasionally, he'd glance up at me as if to check whether I was all right. Finally, he closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. So he began choosing his words slowly. "They think they own the place." I nodded. He pursed his lips. "Technically, they're squatting if they haven't transferred the deed or if you haven't signed anything relinquishing your ownership." The word squatting sounded jarring, but I realized it was the legal term for occupying a property without the rightful owner's permission. It felt strange to label my own family as squatters, but that was exactly the situation. Jeffrey explained that since I was still paying taxes and had never removed my name from the deed, the house was legally mine. He asked me what I wanted to do. I took a moment before answering. What did I want? Initially, I'd wanted simply to be respected, but now it seemed the lines had been drawn. My options ranged from doing nothing, letting James and Caroline continue as they had been, to formally evicting them. Part of me balked at the idea of issuing an eviction notice to my own son, but another part, the part that remembered nights freezing in the basement, felt a quiet resolve. They had forced my hand, and I was done letting them walk all over me. In the end, we decided on a course of action that would give them a clear legal message without starting a public showdown. Jeffrey recommended filing the paperwork for an eviction notice, which would inform them they had 30 days to vacate unless we came to some other agreement. We drafted the documents, and he promised to handle everything discreetly. "No need for police or drama," he said. "We'll let the law do its work." As I stood to leave, Jeffrey gave me a compassionate look. "I'm sorry it's come to this, Margaret," he said. "I remember how close you and James used to be, but you have to protect yourself." I nodded, grateful for his understanding. Before stepping out of the office, I glanced at the folder once more. The papers inside represented years of responsible planning documents Robert and I had prepared without ever imagining they'd be used this way. Yet here I was invoking the law against my own child. Walking outside, I wrapped my coat tighter against the wind. A small wave of relief washed over me. The legal ball was rolling, and while I didn't relish the confrontation, I felt a renewed sense of autonomy. I was no longer a passive spectator in my own life. I was taking control one legal motion at a time. Several days later, while enjoying my usual morning tea by the apartment window, I got a call from Jeffrey's office. His receptionist informed me that the documents had been delivered by courier. I could almost picture James or Caroline opening the door expecting a package, only to find a thick envelope filled with legal jargon. My stomach fluttered at the thought, torn between dread and a guilty satisfaction. I spent the day in a state of quiet anticipation, half expecting my phone to ring, yet the hours dragged on with no call from James. It wasn't until late in the evening that my cell phone vibrated on the coffee table. I hesitated before answering. Heart pounding, the number was familiar. Mom. James's voice came through sounding uncertain, almost hesitant. We got something in the mail. From a lawyer? A silence followed, heavy and charged. I could feel the weight of what he was trying to process. Yes, I know, I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady. He cleared his throat. Is this some kind of mistake? His tone was edged with a mixture of disbelief and anger. It's an eviction notice for this house. Yes, I repeated, setting my teacup down so I wouldn't spill it. I'm sorry it had to come to this, James, but you and Caroline left me with no choice. I could almost hear the wheels turning in his mind. But the bills are in our name, the mailbox, everything we've been living here. His voice rose, echoing with the confusion of someone who had overlooked the most critical detail. The legal ownership, that doesn't change the fact that the deed is still in my name, I said, my throat tightening. I never signed anything over to you. You might be handling the day-to-day expenses, but legally it's my property. For a moment, all I heard was the crackle of the line. Then he sputtered a vague protest, something about how Caroline was pregnant and they were expecting a baby, how they had invested in renovations. I felt a pang of remorse, but I reminded myself of the basement nights. The mailbox with only his name, the emotional isolation that had driven me to leave. James ended the call abruptly. We'll figure this out, he said. We can't just leave. I thought I heard Caroline in the background asking questions. Her voice frayed. Then there was a click and silence. Afterward, I sat for a long time, staring at the phone in my hand. I thought about calling him back, telling him I was open to discussion, that there might be a way to resolve this without uprooting everyone. But then I remembered the weeks of disregard, the humiliating sense of displacement in my own home. I also remembered that I had offered countless times to talk and had been consistently dismissed. This time I needed to stand firm. Somewhere in the building, I heard a neighbor turning up their television, a mundane sign that life went on around me. And for the first time since leaving my house, I felt something resembling closure. Maybe this was the turning point. Maybe James and Caroline would finally see that I wasn't just a powerless old woman. I had made my move, and now they had to decide how to respond. True to James's word, they tried to figure it out. Over the next week, my phone buzzed relentlessly. Sometimes it was James. Other times it was Caroline, sobbing into the receiver. They pleaded with me, asked if we could discuss this in person. Part of me was tempted to meet them after all. They were my family. But each time I hesitated, recalling how they treated me as an afterthought, how they never once asked me about my well-being after I left. Eventually, I agreed to sit down with them at a neutral location, a small cafe not far from my apartment. I chose a corner table for some privacy, my heart pounding as I waited. When they arrived, Caroline's eyes were red as though she had been crying. James wore a tight, pained expression, his shoulders tensed. They looked like two people who'd been forced to confront the gravity of their actions. Caroline was the first to speak. Mom, this whole eviction thing, it's so extreme. We didn't know. Her voice cracked on the last word. I took a slow breath. You didn't know what? That you were shutting me out of my own home? That you changed the mailbox, the locks, and forced me to sleep in the basement? I made no effort to mask the pain in my voice. It was time they heard it clearly. James winced, reaching for my hand across the table. I pulled it back, folding my hands in my lap instead. He swallowed hard. Mom, we never meant to hurt you. We were just trying to take over responsibilities after Dad died. We thought you might need a break. That's not what it felt like. I countered, my gaze steady. It felt like you were pushing me out. The day I found only your name on the mailbox was the day I realized I'd lost my place in my own home. Caroline started crying softly, and James glanced around, clearly uncomfortable with the public setting. He leaned in, lowering his voice. Look, we messed up, but you can't just kick us out. We have a baby on the way. We've spent money on renovations. Isn't there another way? I thought about it. Part of me considered the possibility of letting them stay if they paid rent or at least acknowledged me as the homeowner. But I remembered the nights in the basement, the open disregard for my belongings and my comfort, the sense that I was unwanted in a space that I had built with my husband. So I made my decision. I'm willing to let you stay, I said carefully, but on my terms. That means I remain the homeowner. You'd be my tenants paying monthly rent at market rate. We'd sign a proper lease. That's the only arrangement that makes sense now, given everything that's happened. James's face tightened. Caroline stifled a sob, dabbing at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. Rent market rate, she repeated in disbelief. We can't afford that, especially with a baby coming. I shrugged, feeling a guilty pang, but also resolute. Then you'll have to leave. I paused, letting the words sink in. I didn't want it to come to this, but you made it clear you didn't want to share the house with me on equal footing. If you can't pay rent, you need to find somewhere else to live. James ran a hand through his hair, staring at the table. Caroline broke into fresh tears. I felt a sting of sadness, but also a calm clarity. After all those nights of feeling powerless, I finally stood on solid ground. In the end, James and Caroline chose to leave. There was no tearful reconciliation, no last-minute compromise. A week later, a moving truck arrived at the house. My house, and they loaded up their furniture, the baby crib, and countless boxes of possessions. I didn't go to watch them depart, but I heard about it from my cousin Sharon, who seemed both shocked and relieved at the outcome. I can't believe it came to this, she said over the phone, her voice hushed. But maybe this will be a wake-up call for them. Once they were gone, Jeffrey and I began the process of selling the house. It was a difficult decision, but I felt it was the best path forward. Too many painful memories lingered in those rooms, and I wanted a clean start. Within a couple of months, we found a buyer, a retired couple from out of state, who fell in love with the neighborhood and the oak tree in the front yard. The offer was good, more than I had expected. I accepted it without hesitation, signing the closing documents with a bittersweet sense of finality. I can't say the transaction brought me pure joy. That house was where I built my life with Robert. It had seen years of holiday gatherings, children's laughter, and the milestones of a marriage. Letting it go felt like letting go of a piece of my heart. But I also recognized that I could no longer cling to a place that had become a battleground between me and my own family. With the proceeds from the sale, I made a quiet, strategic move. I bought a small cottage near a serene lake on the outskirts of town. It had a cozy porch, a garden patch in the backyard, and a spare room that I planned to turn into a sewing nook. The first time I walked through the cottage, I felt a wave of peace wash over me. The hardwood floors were worn and the walls needed a fresh coat of paint, but I saw potential, a chance to build something new. Meanwhile, James and Caroline relocated to a rental home a few miles away. We weren't on speaking terms at the time, though I occasionally heard updates through the family grapevine. Caroline gave birth to a baby girl, a granddaughter I'd yet to meet. I won't lie, that stung deeply. but I understood that bridges sometimes take time to rebuild. On my first night in the cottage, I stood on the porch gazing at the moonlit lake. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a pair of loons let out their haunting call. I thought of Robert and smiled, imagining how he would have loved the tranquility of this place. It wasn't as grand as our old home, but it felt more like a sanctuary, a space that was fully and truly mine. For the first time in a long while, I felt no tension in my shoulders, no heaviness in my chest. I might have lost the house I once cherished, but in exchange, I found the gift of peace. In that moment, I knew I had made the right decision. I had taken back control of my life, and no one could take that away from me again. Settling into the cottage took some work. I repainted the walls a soft lavender, choosing the color for its calming effect. I purchased a secondhand sewing machine from a local thrift store and set it up in the spare room. Whenever I felt the pang of loneliness, I'd head into that room and stitch small projects: pillowcases, table runners, sometimes even little baby blankets that I donated to the local church. In those quiet moments, I found solace in the gentle hum of the needle moving across the fabric and the familiar rhythm that reminded me of better times. Sometimes my mind drifted back to the old house. I would remember the laughter of Christmas mornings when the children would run down the stairs, or the romantic dinners Robert and I shared after the kids fell asleep. In those memories, the house glowed with warmth, a place of togetherness. I tried to hold on to that version of it rather than the toxic environment it had become. I didn't do what I did for revenge, and that's something I hope my son will one day understand. The eviction notice, the sale of the house. These were steps I took for self-preservation, not malice. I needed to draw a line in the sand to show them that I wasn't going to fade quietly into the background. Deep down, I think James knows this. I could hear it in the tremor of his voice during our last conversation, as if he was beginning to realize the enormity of what he had done. For a while, I kept the same phone number in case James or Caroline decided to reach out. But weeks passed, then months, and nothing came. I occasionally spoke to extended family members who informed me that James was focusing on his new job and Caroline was busy with the baby. There was talk that they might be planning to move to another state where housing was cheaper. I listened politely and tried not to let it show how much I missed my son. One evening, as I sat by the lake, I wrote in a journal. I wrote about my feelings of both heartbreak and liberation. I jotted down memories of Robert, our first meeting, our wedding day, the births of our children. Then I wrote about the basement and the final straw that led me to pack my bags. At some point, tears blurred the ink, but I kept writing, letting the emotions pour out. When I closed the journal, I noticed the sun dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and pink. A sense of calm washed over me. Despite the sadness of losing connection with James, I felt a quiet pride in having stood up for myself. Sometimes in life, we have to choose our own well-being over the comfort of others. And while I mourned the rift in my family, I also recognized the importance of not letting their actions define my final years. They may have taken the walls and floors of the old house, but I kept the intangible foundation: my spirit, my values, my self-respect. And no deed or lock or mailbox name change could ever take that away from me. Months passed, and life at the lake cottage began to feel like a peaceful routine. I discovered I had neighbors who shared my love of gardening. We bonded over seedlings and compost tips, and soon my small backyard was bursting with flowers and herbs. Every Sunday morning, I joined a local women's group at the community center where we would read novels aloud and discuss the themes. This new chapter of my life, so unexpected and unplanned, was surprisingly fulfilling. Still, there was a lingering ache. I was a grandmother now, but I had never held my granddaughter in my arms. I'd never seen her tiny hands or heard her first coo. The knowledge that I might never meet her weighed heavily on me. Occasionally, I'd catch myself imagining how different things could have been if James and Caroline had simply communicated better, if we'd found a way to live under the same roof without pushing me out. The what ifs haunted me in the quieter moments, but I tried to focus on the present. One afternoon, while sorting through old letters, I came across a photograph. It showed James as a toddler perched on Robert's shoulders in our backyard with me standing next to them laughing. In that moment, I felt a wave of nostalgia so strong it nearly took my breath away. Tears welled in my eyes, but they weren't just tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude for the beautiful memories we did share. I decided to send James a letter, not an email or a text message, but a handwritten note, the way we used to communicate before technology took over. I wrote, "Dear James, I hope you and Caroline are well, and I hope my granddaughter is healthy and thriving. I'm sorry for any pain I've caused, but I also want you to understand that I did what I had to do to protect myself. I love you. You'll always be my son. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. Love, Mom." I enclosed the old photograph thinking maybe it would remind him of simpler times. I mailed it the following day, not expecting much. It was my olive branch, a small step toward closure, whether or not James chose to respond. After that, I went about my daily life, continuing to make my cottage feel like home. I hung new curtains, arranged paintings from a local artist, and let the soft hush of the lake lull me to sleep each night. The letter remained unanswered for several weeks. Sometimes a pang of disappointment would strike me, but I refused to let it fester. I had given James a way to reach me. The ball was in his court. Meanwhile, I reveled in the quiet joys of my new life, the fresh morning air by the water, the satisfaction of baking apple pies for the local bake sale, and the camaraderie of new friends who reminded me I wasn't alone in my journey. And in the midst of all this, I found a measure of internal peace. The bitterness I once felt began to dissipate, replaced by a gentle acceptance. I might have lost the physical house where my memories were made, but I was forging new ones every day, and I had safeguarded something far more precious, my sense of self. About 6 months after I mailed that letter, I came home from the grocery store to find a note taped to my front door. The handwriting was unfamiliar, slanted. Careful, I opened it to read Mom. "I hope it's okay. I came by. We'd like to see you. James." Underneath was a phone number and a time he planned to call. My hands shook as I read and reread those words. True to his note, he called later that evening. The conversation was tentative and awkward but civil. He told me they had decided not to move out of state after all. He admitted that the eviction had been a wake-up call, though it still stung his pride. Caroline, he said, had finally agreed to therapy and counseling together. They were working through their issues, especially how they handled the situation with me. When James asked if he, Caroline, and their daughter could come visit me at the cottage, I had to bite back a rush of emotion. Part of me feared it was too soon, that opening the door again might risk another heartbreak. But I thought of my granddaughter, how I had never held her, and felt my resolve soften. "Okay," I said quietly, "but I want us to meet on neutral ground first. Let's go for a walk by the lake." That weekend, they arrived in a small SUV. Caroline stepped out first, holding a chubby-cheeked baby girl in a pastel pink outfit. My heart skipped a beat. I approached cautiously, feeling like a stranger in a world that should have been familiar. When Caroline handed the baby over to me, tears welled in my eyes as I gazed into those curious brown orbs. I think I saw a flicker of recognition there, as if she somehow sensed who I was. We walked along the lake's edge, exchanging small talk. James apologized not in a grand speech, but in a series of quiet admissions that he'd let me down, that he hadn't realized how his actions made me feel. Caroline was still reserved, but she did say, "I'm sorry for everything, Margaret." While struggling to hold back tears, I appreciated her effort. It was more than I'd ever expected after the eviction notice. We didn't dwell on the past too much. Some topics remained too raw, too fraught with pain. Instead, we focused on the present, on the baby's name, Elizabeth, and how she just learned to clap her hands, on how therapy was helping James and Caroline communicate better, on the small details of my life at the cottage, the new friends I'd made, the projects I was working on. For a brief time, we felt like a family again, albeit a more cautious one. Before leaving, James asked if they could visit again. He looked around at the cottage, the garden, the view of the lake, and said, "This place suits you, Mom. I'm glad you found peace here." I nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by a rush of gratitude. In that moment, I felt a door open, not just the door of my cottage, but the door to healing between us. It wouldn't be instantaneous. Trust would have to be rebuilt slowly, but at least we were finally standing in the same space, acknowledging each other's feelings in a way we hadn't before. They drove away, promising to return soon. I watched their car disappear down the winding road, the baby's face pressed against the window. A breeze rustled the trees, and the lake glimmered in the afternoon sun. Maybe I thought, just maybe, there was hope for a future where we could all coexist. One where I wouldn't have to choose between my self-respect and my relationship with my son. Time has a way of softening the rough edges of pain. In the following months, I spent more afternoons with James, Caroline, and little Elizabeth, who quickly became the light of my life. I savored every babbling sound she made, every tentative step she took along the lakeside path. Although I never fully forgot how they had treated me, I learned to compartmentalize those memories. The eviction and the hurtful takeover were still part of our shared history, but they no longer defined every interaction we had. James and Caroline began to ask me for advice on parenting, on budgeting, even on how to cook a proper Sunday roast. Each time I felt a ripple of gratitude. They were beginning to see me not as a feeble old woman, but as a mother with wisdom and experience. We didn't discuss the old house much, but I suspected they felt a pang whenever they drove by it, now owned by another family. Sometimes I thought about how symbolic it was that they couldn't remain in a structure that had been built on my and Robert's terms. If they wanted a home, they had to build or find one for themselves, free of the illusions that they could simply overwrite my presence. On a warm spring evening, they invited me to see their new place, a modest rental in a family-friendly neighborhood a few miles from my cottage. Caroline led me through the house, showing off the nursery she'd set up for Elizabeth, complete with a mobile of little birds. Gone were the controlling undertones that once colored her every action. Instead, she seemed eager for my input, pointing to different areas and asking, "What do you think, Margaret? Is this a good spot for a reading nook?" While there, James took me aside. "Mom," he said, hesitating as he looked down at his feet, "I know it might be too late, but I want you to know. I'm sorry, I didn't realize how hurtful we were being until it was too late." His eyes were full of remorse. I reached out and squeezed his hand. "Sometimes we don't see what's right in front of us," I said softly. "I'm just glad we have a chance to make it right now." The conversation reminded me of the final lesson I'd learned through this ordeal. Sometimes you have to walk away and protect your boundaries to be truly seen. By choosing to leave everything behind and exercise my legal right, I forced James and Caroline to face the consequences of their actions. It wasn't an easy choice, and it certainly wasn't a happy one at the time, but it was necessary. Now, as I sit in my cottage, I sip tea by the window and watch the sun rise over the calm waters of the lake. Birds chirp in the distance, and the faint smell of lavender drifts from my garden. I still think about the old house, about Robert, about the life we built within those walls. But I know now that real security, real belonging, isn't tied to a physical structure. It lives within our hearts, within the relationships we choose to nurture. If there's one message I'd share with anyone feeling invisible in their own home, it's this. Remember that you always have a move to make. You may be quiet, you may be older, tired, or unsure, but your voice matters, even in the face of dismissal and neglect. You retain power over your own life sometimes in ways others can't see or refuse to acknowledge. And when the moment comes, you can lay that card on the table with calm strength, changing everything in a single stroke of a pen. Sometimes, the only way to be heard, I've come to realize, is to walk away with the last word written in ink. I still ache for what was lost, for the months of estrangement and the memories that never got made. But I also revel in what I gained: a renewed self respect, a new home by the lake, and slowly but surely the first steps toward a mended bond with my family. The walls of the old house may be gone, but I kept the foundation of who I am, and that more than anything is my true inheritance. Thank you so much for sharing Margaret's inspiring journey here at her Fireside Stories. I hope her story has touched your heart and reminded you of the strength we all carry within us. Margaret taught us that no matter our age or circumstance, we always have power over our own destiny. Sometimes the strongest moves are the ones no one expects. If Margaret's story resonated with you, please leave a comment below sharing your personal reflections. I'd truly love to know your thoughts and from where you've joined us today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to bring more heartfelt, empowering stories directly to you. Click the notification bell so you won't miss our next gathering by the fire. Until we meet again, keep your heart strong, your spirit bright, and always remember, you're never without a move. Goodbye for now, and stay warm by our fireside.